Okay, hello. Just a reminder, we are here Wednesday the 10th. The quiz for Module 4 is due today. Your pre-lab is due today. Nothing else for the rest of the week. For homework 2, I asked the previous section if they could find the link for the extra credit survey, and people reporting that they could. I did get a question in Canvas yesterday, where is it? So if I am on my best behavior, I'm going to include the link. I'll go back and edit the future assignments to include the links. Be aware, even though the link is there, the survey is not available until the day that it's due and then just the day after. So you only have at most 48 hours to answer that one question. And we went through all these slides on Monday, so I'm not going to go through them. What I wanted to do is a coding exercise, and I'm going to show you my process for how I create code. And then, you can create your own process, but I'm going to give you some tips that at least they work for me. Also, yeah, we're fine last week. Okay, so what I want to do, and I've put this code online for you. What we're going to do today is recreate that code. It will not be an exact duplicate because, I'm human and I'm going to make different decisions today than I did when I created those back then, but the general result will be the same. So the way I create code, I think about, okay, what classes do I need? And once I decide what classes I need, I have to think about what job do I want each class to do. So I start thinking about what attributes and methods does each class need. And all I'm going to do here is create a list of random numbers. And then I'm going to ask myself, hey, what am I going to do with a list of random numbers, right? So I'll create one class that is the container for the class of random numbers and one class that controls them. So I have my random data.java class. That's the one that contains the list of random numbers. And then I have the random data controller. That's the one that's going to create an object of that class, create the actual, tell that class to create random numbers, and then do stuff with it. Okay, so we start out with asking ourselves what attributes do we need and what methods do we need. So what attributes do you think you need? What do you think?
Possibly like an array to store the random numbers?
Yeah, we need a list of random numbers. So how about I make an array of random numbers? In the example I put online, I think I made them integers. I'm going to make them doubles. So double, and I'm going to call it the data set. That's the data set of numbers. And then up here under attributes, I remember, do it while you're creating them. And because it's an attribute, I'm going to make it private. If I want it to be an attribute, I want it to be outside of the main method. That's correct. And then here's a question. Does this class need a main method?
No.
No, because the other class is going to have that. Okay. Now that I know that I have these random numbers, if I said, hey, I've got a list of random numbers, what questions might you ask about that list? That's how you're going to determine what methods you want.
the minimum and the maximum.
Okay,
number.
let's do minimum and maximum, right? So let's do, and this is how you do it. And you have to call what you're going, determine what you're going to call these methods. Normally, when I'm looking for something, I call it find. When I'm calculate something, I call it calculate. When I'm returning something, I call it get. So I'm going to call this find max value. So I don't actually make them. I just make a note to myself that I want to have these things. What else might you do? Well, let's see. If I go over here,
The sum of all numbers.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sum.
This,
And sometimes I use numbers, sometimes I use values. I mean, this doesn't matter, right? You just try to be consistent and try to spell correctly. There we go. Okay. And let's leave it there for now. So now what am I going to do over here? What I'm saying is, oh, I'm going to go and create this object, and then I'm going to find the min, find the max, that kind of thing. So again, I don't have to do this as when I'm first thinking through. And what the heck, usually we find the average too, right? Okay. So let's create the random data object. So if you start out this way and all you do is you're making comments in your code about what you're going to do, you can start to flesh out your classes. You don't get bogged down in details. Don't get bogged down in the detail until you have to. So don't actually make the method until you have to. And that way you're always focused on one tiny little problem at a time. For example, I want to create the random data object. I have a choice to make. Do I want that object to be an attribute or a variable? There's no wrong answer. Okay, I'm going to make it a variable just because I don't need to use it outside of the main method. So I'm going to make it as a variable inside the main method. Its data type is random data, and I'm going to call it data equals new random data. And now I've created an object of that class. I haven't done anything with it yet, right? So now let's go ahead and find the minimum. What's the minimum value right now? And again, I've created this class. Here's what the class is. It's got I've set up an attribute that's going to be an array of doubles. At this moment in time, if I try to run this thing, what's the minimum value? How many values are in there? How big is the array right now? Have I created an array?
You don't know. There's no numbers yet.
you have not created an array.
There's no numbers. I haven't even created the array. Remember, an array is an object. How do you know when you have a new object? When you actually have the new keyword. So right now I've created the random data class, and it has a placeholder for an array to be built, but I haven't built the array. And I haven't given it any numbers yet. Will this compile and run? Sure, this will compile and run. It won't do anything. It won't tell us anything. Oops. Okay, I've got the class files from the previous lecture. So it doesn't do anything. I can do, get this where you guys can see it. There we go. I can compile it. Start out Java will compile all the files, and then I can run. And it ran, and since I didn't print anything out, I don't get any feedback, but it ran. I recommend saving, compiling, and running often. And the reason I recommend that is, if you have an issue, you know right where the issue is. What you're doing is you're convincing yourself that your skeleton of your code is okay, that you've got classes that can actually talk to each other. All right, so now what we need to do is create the random data, right? The actual data. And usually that's called an initialization. So I'm going to call this initialization. Well, if you notice over here, I said, here's my methods: find max, find min, calculate sum. I'm probably going to do calculate average. Gosh. What I don't have is anything that actually builds the array. So how about if I build a method called initialize dataset? And again, initialization is a normal term. Usually when you start your program, you have to bring in a bunch of data and set it all up. That's initialization. If you think about a board game, how do you play a lot of you guys are doing games, which is great. How do you do a board game? You set up a chessboard. What do? You have to set up all the pieces in their proper places. That's the initialization. Ever played Monopoly? Everyone gets, what do you get? 200, $1,000 or whatever. That's the initialization. So we're gonna create a method that initializes. Now, should it be public or private?
Wow.
50-50 shot, guys. Virtually all your attributes are private. Virtually all your methods are public. Does it have a return type? Is it returning anything?
No.
No, because all it's doing is, remember, methods typically, a lot of methods are actually just modifying attribute values there so they don't return anything. That's what this is doing. It's modifying an attribute value. And what did I call it? Initialize data set. And if I'm going to do this, I always do this, by the way. I create my opening and closing curly brackets. Eclipse will do that automatically for you before I start filling things in. And the reason I do that, once I start filling things in, I often forget to close the curly bracket. And then I get weird compilation errors that are hard to fix. Do I know how big to make this thing? How about let that be an input parameter to the method. And again, my first cut at this method is going to look like this. I would actually do this for all of my methods. Not defined. Compile it. Call it from here. Let's put in 10 numbers initially. Compile it and run. And notice what I did, initialize data set call, not defined at this time. I would do that for all these methods. Find max value, find min value. I would do that for all of them. And and if they have to return something, like find max value probably actually is going to return a value, I'd have it just return 0 and still print out, this is not defined at this time. Why would I do that? Well, again, think about software design. I want you to build this program that's composed of a bunch of different classes. I need you to think about what each class is and what it does. And you want to have that fully defined before you start to actually do your coding. If you only do a little bit and you start to code, it's very confusing. And if you're trying to build out all the classes at the same time, you get bogged down in the details. You're going back and forth between class and class. You can't remember where you are and what you finished in one part and what you have to do in the next part. So what you do is you can create all these things as dummy methods and then run your code. And what you're doing is you're convincing yourself that the structure of the code is correct. The objects can talk to each other in the way that you intended. You're not getting good values yet, but the objects can talk to you, can talk to each other. So you've got this notion of a skeletal code. You'll hear the term walking skeleton sometimes. And then what you can do is build out one method at a time. And if you're just working on one method, you've got a very small problem to deal with. You can handle it. If I asked you to do a homework assignment where all you had to do was create an array of numbers, that's not even enough work for a homework assignment. So what you're doing is you're reducing the scope of the stuff you have to deal with at any single point in time to a very small sliver of the program. You can focus on that one thing. Okay. So now that I've convinced myself that these two classes can talk to each other and I can actually call this method. And again, I might do it for all of these and call them all and just have them all print out. Somebody called me and I'm not defined yet. Before I went further, but let's go ahead and actually initialize the data set. So right now, we don't have an actual array yet because an array is an object and you don't get the object until you have the new keyword. So what we can do now is say data set equals new data set. It's a new array, I'm sorry. New double size. There we go. That's how we make a new array. So what did I do on line 18? Up here on line 18, I said, okay, I'm going to have an attribute, which is this attribute is an array of doubles. All I did was create a placeholder for the array. Remember, the array only knows where the head of the array is in memory. So I just created a placeholder to keep track of that array if I ever built one, but I haven't built, I haven't built it yet, right? So then when I say data set equals new double, now it actually puts the array in memory and the Java virtual machine keeps track of where the head of that array is. And now I want to go ahead and actually fill this in with values. So I'm going to use a for loop and I'm just going to put random values in. For now we use the length attribute of the array, which is nice. And then and again, I'm going to close out my curly brackets. And all I do here is the ith entity is equal to, let's go, numbers between 0 and 10,000 just for grins. So it's going to be 10,000 times math dot random, except I should spell it right, math dot random. So now I've got numbers between 0 and 10,000. And they're going to be ugly if I ever want to print them out and look at them. So just to make it less ugly, I'm going to do truncate that. I'm going to take the floor. Okay. Now, I wrote a method. I'm going to go ahead and save both of these files, compile it, run it. It seems to have run. Notice I do a little bit of coding, compile and run. A little bit of coding, compile and run. Now, how do I know that I actually made that array, filled it with 10 values? How do I know that?
Make another method that displays it on the console.
Right, right. Yeah, and the answer is I don't know. I don't know. So how do you fix that? Let's print it out. And this kind of a thing, you're going to print it out primarily for debugging purposes, right? To verify that your code is working correctly. Because once I change this 10 to 100,000, probably don't want to print it out. But if I start playing around with a little array, then I can convince myself that the behavior is good. Once the behavior is good on little arrays, I can make big giant arrays if I want to. Okay, so let's do public void print data set. It doesn't need any input parameters. And all it does is it goes through a for loop. And instead of setting random values, it prints out the there we go. And this is going to be and it's what, data set? Okay, so now let's save that. And then I'm going to call that over here. Compile and run. There and there. What do you know? We actually have 10 values. So you see the process here. I did one little thing at a time. Now that print data set, in the actual working program, I may never use it. Again, if we're actually working with really big pieces of data, we probably are never going to print that. But I put it in there just to help with development. Should I take it out once I'm done? No. You don't know in the future if you might want to actually print these things. So go ahead and keep it in there. It's okay if you have methods that aren't ever called, you know, as long as you, period. It's okay to have methods that aren't called. Notice, by the way, also, I had my initial list of methods that I thought I needed, and I've already added 2 that I didn't think of right off the bat, the initialize and the print. Right? We thought about find max, find min, average, sum, that kind of thing, but we didn't think of initialize and print. That's normal. You're going to make your first attempt at what you think the methods are in your classes, and as you start to develop your software, you'll say, oh, wait a minute, I have a need for another method that I didn't realize at first. No problem. Just add it in, or make a note that you have to add it in. To do, make this method, and then add it in. You can add it in as a dummy method off the bat. Notice what I'm doing too. I'm not trying to make this whole class at the same time and then go build another class. I'm putting notes in as to what I think this class can do, and I'm deciding on attribute names, and I'm deciding on method names, but I'm not getting bogged down in the details. I only go to a detail when I have to. Oh, I have to create the data. Okay, initialize data, time to write that method. Notice how small these methods are too. Try to make methods that do little teeny tiny jobs. Very specific jobs, and then name them what they do. Have some kind of a naming convention for yourself. And as you go along, don't do all your methods and then update your code block up top. Do it right off the bat. Boy, right? And do this kind of documentation as you go. What is it, print? Okay. Now, what I'm doing is by the way, this is code. This is shorthand code right here. For my attributes, it's a negative sign, the name of the attribute. Negative sign data set, semicolon, colon, and then double. So what is that? The negative means it's private. Data set is the name. And then after the colon, you put the data type. So I'm saying if you read that, it's a private named data set and it's an array of doubles. Plus sign means positive and you list for the return type. So the method is publicly available. Its name is initialized data set. Its return type is void. And then off to the side, I say briefly, what does it do? This one is a public method. Its name is print data set and its data type is, its return type is void and it prints the values in the data set. Okay. Let's do the sum. So we said calculate sum of values. Let's do that one. Easy one, right? Public or private? Public. Is it going to return anything?
Yes.
I think we should return the actual sum, right? And what is the sum? What's the data type of that? It's going to be a double. And I use, again, calculate. I don't need any input. I use calculate whenever I'm actually calculating something, find when I'm looking for something, and get setters and getters I reserve for the setting and getting of attribute values. Okay, so calculate sum of values. Let's see, how do you do that? You start out with the sum is equal to 0, and then you just start adding up, right? So I'm going to have to declare basically a counter here. By the way, for all I know, Java has an automatic sum feature as part of the array object. That it may already have that. I'm just going to ignore that. And then I'm going to go through the loop. And I'm just going to keep adding the sum. Whoops. What is it? Sum equals sum plus data set I. And then we return the sum. And same trick, let's see if that actually worked. So now what I'm going to do is data, I'm going to print it out. And what data dot calculate sum. Always make sure your names are the same. This is where Eclipse helps you. Calculate sum of values. Oh, okay, sum. That's probably too long of a name. Oh well. Okay. Save this. Save this. Find out how many typos I have. Symbol method. Error cannot find symbol. Oh, cannot find symbol. Data calculate. I must have a typo. Calculate sum of values, and it's calculate sum, lowercase o. There we go. Read your error messages. If you cannot find symbol, it means that you're trying to access an attribute or a method that doesn't exist. Usually it's a typo. Yay. Okay, now I've made a design decision. Did anybody catch it? It's a design decision that I made here when I did that. Any thoughts on the design decision that I made? It's a small one. I don't think there's a wrong answer. The design decision was who gets to print the sum. Should the random data object print the sum, or should the controller print the sum? Notice when we said print data set, we did that all inside the random data.java. So I could have made the print method inside of here. Now, should I made it part of calculate sum of values?
No.
I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. I'm gonna come back to that question in just a second. Instead, let's do the average first. Let's do, oh gosh. That's not right. That looks better. Okay. So I'm going to do the average, and so I'm going to do calculate average, and same trick. It's going to be public. It's going to return a double. Its name is calculate average. It doesn't need any input. And what's the easiest way to do this? It's to do, I'm going to do this two ways, and so I'm going to do it once and then I'm going to change it. I'm going to say double average equals, and then I'm going to return the average. And how do I get the average of something?
Will it be the calculate sum of it will be sum divided by 10?
Right. Well, yeah, but let's not say 10. Let's say data size dot length. Right. Right. So yeah, how do you do an average? You sum up all the values and divide by the number of values. Well, you've already got a method. Ooh. Calculate. You've already got a method to sum up all the values, and then you can divide by the length. Now we might have some. Well, it'll be interesting to see how Java does this, because the top is a double and the bottom is an integer. So who knows if it's going to try to convert this to an integer? We'll find out. But notice how this works. Not only do all the methods have access to all the attributes, the methods have access to the other methods. So you make your methods do really tiny little jobs, and if you need to do something a little more sophisticated, you call the methods.
Quick
Now
question.
I'm going to make this even shorter because I can just do that. What was the value of having that extra variable in there? Now, the trick is, ask yourself, is this code readable? Is it understandable? Let's see, public double calculate average. That's a method. What do you think its job is? It calculates the average. How does it do it? It calculates the sum divided by the length. The length is the number of elements in the array. Hopefully that's easy to follow. And by the way, hopefully this is easy to follow. By putting all the details in the methods, right? I say this a lot during the semester. Try not to do any actual work in the main. All the main does is ask everybody else to do stuff. So main says, hey, create a new random data object, initialize the data set, print the sum, print the average. And you can just read through that and you're like, oh, I see what's going on. As long as all the names are good. All right, so I save this guy, I save this guy, and then I'm gonna compile and run and find out where all my typos are. And there you go. Okay, so it divided by integer just fine and held it as a double, which is, again, I thought that's what Java did, but I don't remember. And there's no reason for you to have to remember every little detail of Java. You do tests or you look up, you can look up the documentation. The easiest thing is to run and see. Let's see, if the total is 59,182, it makes sense since there's 10 elements that the average is 5,918.2. So what am I doing? I'm building this code up a little bit at a time, a few lines of code, compile and run. And I'm verifying that it's actually doing what I thought it was doing as I go. Now, the design decision that I made was that the data controller is going to print out this value. But, and there's no wrong answer, but it might be better if the object actually could tell you about itself, if the object could print out information about itself. And that way, for example, right now the data controller is going to print this stuff out. What if I had another class where we wanted to print that stuff out? Then I would have to duplicate this stuff over there. Instead, if I put that functionality inside the object, then you just call those methods from the object. So I'm going to modify this, and I'm going to create another method that I didn't think I needed at the beginning called print sum of values. And I'm going to modify this to, I'm doing two things at once, so expect badness. Print the average. So you name it what it does. And then it's easy to create those guys over here. We can use the same trick we had before of in fact, you know what I would do? I would make a whole class of methods that print things. And I would move, oh gosh, where did it go? This print data set, I'm going to move that down there. Just to try to keep things organized. All right, so what did I say? I'm going to have two things that print. I'm going to have public void print sum of values. Hopefully that's what it was called. And I'm going to have public, gosh darn, void average. And all we do is call the other things that actually do the work. System dot out dot. I should have cut and pasted, right? And now I just call this, and I can call calculate sum of values. And down here, I can do the same trick with try that again. There we go. There. So what I'm doing is I'm calling these other methods from the methods. Now there's something that's a little bit confusing maybe. So let me make sure we clarify this before before I compile it and find out I have errors. Notice over here, I have to say data dot and then the name of the method. But once I'm inside the object, I don't do that. I just say the name of the method. And the reason is once I'm inside the object, I know what method I'm talking about. When I'm outside the object, I can't just say, hey, call a method. I have to say, call a method that's in this object. But once I'm inside the object, I already know I already know where this method is going to be. It's going to be inside the method. So be aware of these little tiny distinctions in form that can be confusing if you're not understanding what they're telling you. Okay, let's compile this and see if it does anything. Besides errors. Oh, there you go. Data print. Oh, extra. There we go. By the way, pay attention to it said, hey, you gave me a parentheses and I thought you were going to give me a semicolon, right? Read the error messages. They will tell you what's going on. Now, sometimes they get really long, but go to the top and the first thing it tells you is here's what's wrong. And it seems to work. So this is how I recommend that you build code, especially for your project. And I'm going to the way the project assignments are set up, it kind of forces you to do this. So your next deliverable is describing the problem, but not the software, so that I'm trying to get you to think deeply about what the problems are, that the thing you're trying to create in terms of functionality. So if you have a game, you better tell me the rules of the game. If you have a game, tell me as much as you can about not how you're going to get something done, but what you want done. Fully define the game. A lot of you guys are doing, a guy runs around in a maze and people try to, yeah. In fact, I expect a number of you will change P, and you don't need to resubmit P1. If you change between P1 and P2, you do not need to redo the P1. Just, I'll notice, when I get to P2 that things are different, and that's okay. But the point is, if you got someone running around and there's so many, when its health gets to 0, try to define that fully. Okay, the health starts out at 50, and every time a guy stumbles over a rock, he loses 2. Every time a rock falls on him, he loses 10, or randomly between 5 and 8, or whatever. Try to define it fully, not how. Then in P3, you're going to lay out, oh, okay, in order to do this, I need to have these classes with these attributes and these methods, and you haven't programmed any of it yet, but you're doing exactly what we did here, where we think, okay, I need to do these things, right? You're making notes to yourself, and then making these dummy methods. The best, again, what I would do is, I'm going to do 2 things before we go. What I would do is all these methods that do I have any? Yeah, these guys, find max value, find min value. I would create those, and then, like I said before, all they would do is print out a system message that says find max value has been called, not defined yet. And if it needs to return a value, let it return 0 or 1. Return a dummy value. And that way your whole code will work. It doesn't do anything you wanted it to do yet, but it's working. Your code is basically going to be in 2 halves, the graphical portion that's displaying things to the user, and then the mathematical portion that's actually doing the game or doing the product. I don't care which of those you do first, and people have different preferences on it. But I would do this kind of a technique where you're building out a little at a time. You're never overwhelmed. You're only thinking about, okay, I have to build this one function. I have to build this one function, this one method. Now, I haven't talked about setters and getters. Since the attribute here is an array, the setters and getters become interesting. If I said set the array, what does that really mean? What I might do is something like this. One thing I could do is just call the method that I already did. That's one thing that I could do. That would be a design choice. But what does the getter mean? Oh, I'm sorry. What the heck? Should I even do that? The answer is it depends on your software. What are you doing with that? If you return the array, what are you returning? Is it a copy of all the values? Is it all the values? Or is it just the location of where the array is? It's a tough question, isn't it? It turns out what you're doing is you're passing the location of the array back. So what you're doing is you're telling somebody else how to get access to that array. Since you wanted your array to be private, you might not want to do that. Bless you. And since it's an array, you might actually want setters and getters for the individual elements. And if you do, you have to say which element is it. And you have to say what the value is. And so now we say data set I equals, right? Because since there's a whole bunch of elements, you can't just say set it to 5. I don't know which element you want me to set to 5, so you have to specify the element. Now, there's some bad programming here. What should I do if I'm going to set this data element? What are things that I might want to do to protect myself? Here I just blindly took in I and new value and said, okay, data set I is equal to new value. That's asking for trouble. What should I do if I were going to be a good defensive programmer? Choose a specific data type. Well, yeah, well, we've got those doubles and ints. That's good. Doubles and
Make the method private.
here's what I should do. What if I have 10 elements in my array, right? What if they give me an I of 1,000? Oh, so the first thing I should do is check that I fits the array. And then, depending on my array, if I wanted my array elements to be between 0 and 10,000, I should also check that new value is between 0 and 10,000. So basically, I want to make sure that no one does something bad to me here. And in fact, just to, maybe I can prove this before we go, or demonstrate this before we go. Let's do data dot set element value 500 0.0. Set data set element. Set. See, I forgot the name of my. This is where actually Eclipse will help you. It will. There we go. If I save this, let me run it and see if I can get an error. Initialize data sets. Uh-oh. Where was that? Oh, I see. Right there. Okay, good. And do we get any other errors? It runs. And look what it says. Array index out of bounds exception, the value is 500 and it's too big. Yeah, I went out of bounds from the array. So to be a really, to be a really proper programming, I would have tried to take that into account. But I'm constrained to 50 minutes. I'm already at 51. Okay, guys, I'm gonna let you go. Do you have any quick questions before we go? I hope this was helpful, showing you process. I hope it,
Yeah, I really liked it.
okay, good. All right, guys, I'm gonna let you go. We're late. Thanks.
Have a nice day.
You too.